What's the distribution of carries going to be like for the running backs? Is Pitt's passing game actually kind of good? And what do we make of some of the latest developments from Alliance 412, Pitt's NIL collective? We got answers to those questions and a lot more in this week's mailbag edition of the Morning Pitt here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. All right, welcome to the Friday edition of the Morning Pitt, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. It's the mailbag edition where we take questions from readers on Panther-Lair.com and answer as many as we can here during the Morning Pitt to end the week. You know the deal. I'm Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com, the website Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com, the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet, football, basketball, recruiting. You can find it all at Panther-Lair.com and message boards to interact with hundreds and thousands of other Pitt fans all day, every day at Panther-Lair.com. That's where we take these questions for the mailbag. So if you want to ask a question for the mailbag, maybe one week we'll do it with YouTube commenters, but for the most part, we're going to stick to the message boards, the Between Fifth and Forbes premium message board that we have there at Panther-Lair.com. That's where we're going to take the questions for the mailbag that we do every week here on the Friday edition of the Morning Pitt on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So if you want to contribute a question, you have something you want to get answered, go ask it on the message boards, Panther-Lair.com. And of course, you know the deal here, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Like this video and subscribe so you never miss any of our exclusive Pitt video content, Morning Pitt videos, Monday through Friday, the live show like we do every Wednesday night at 8:30 p.m. here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Pat Narduzzi press conferences, post-practice interviews, practice highlights, all kinds of things. Lots of videos for you to check out at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Now, as you're watching all the Pitt videos and as you're reading all the Pitt content, you need to be looking good and wearing some sweet gear from Home Field. You know the website homefieldapparel.com. They've got the best college sports gear that you're going to find. Their Pitt collection is second to none. It's outstanding stuff. Great. You can see it right there on the screen. That'll cycle around again. You'll see it in a minute. Classic logos that immediately evoke Pitt. I mean, if you look at them and you have no question of what you're looking at. It's instantly recognizable. And it's classic. More than vintage or retro or anything like that. It's a classic Pitt look on a high quality t-shirt. I always say that Home Field has really mastered the two key components. The shirt is high quality, great material. It's soft. It holds its shape. It's very comfortable and it looks awesome. The logos are really, really cool. Some of the coolest Pitt logos and marks that you're going to find. And there's the best part of it all. If you go there now, you go to homefieldapparel.com. Keep watching this video. You click to another browser window, but keep this video rolling. If you go to homefieldapparel.com, you can use the promo code LAIR23, LAIR23, and get 15% off your first order. Homefieldapparel.com for some of the best Pitt gear you're going to find. And use the promo code LAIR23 to get 15% off your first order. You can't beat that. I know you can't beat that. There's no way to beat that. A high quality product at a discount. So go do it right now. LAIR23 at homefieldapparel.com. All right, we got a couple questions to wrap up from last week. We didn't finish in last week's mailbag, so we'll start with those. And Ross Abbott 11 asks, what do you anticipate the percentage of carries will be like for the running backs? Think Rodney Hammond will be closer to 50% or 70%? So just for comparison, I went back and looked at last year's stats. Pitt had, as a team, 521 rushing attempts. Israel Abanikanda had 239 of those. That's 45.9% of the team rushes. Now, if you want to narrow it down just to the running backs, there were 456 rushing attempts by Pitt's running backs. Izzy had 239 of those. That's 52.4%. And granted, he played 11 out of 13 games, so he wasn't out there every single game. But I think that's important context for comparison when we talk about how they're going to split up the carries this year. When Izzy, who was breaking records and leading the nation in rushing touchdowns, only had 52% of the running back carries in 11 games. But still, I think you almost sort of assume running backs are going to miss some time here and there. So even Izzy only had 52% of the carries. And I think you move into this year with Rodney Hammond and Sebo Flemister and Daniel Carter and Derek Davis Jr. and the freshman TJ Harbison and Montrevious Lloyd. I don't know if I'm necessarily looking at Rodney Hammond to get a higher percentage of the running back carries this year than Izzy got last year, even accounting for injuries. I don't see it being I don't see him getting 60% when Izzy only got 52. I don't know if he's going to be drastically below 50%, but I do think there could be more of a committee this year. I think Rodney Hammond will be the number one back. I think he'll be the lead guy, and he'll lead the team in rushing. I think potentially he could be on course for a 1,000-yard season, but I could see him doing it with 51, 50, or 49% of the carries, or maybe in 48. I think Sibo Flemister is probably a guy that we don't really talk about much at all. David Hale from ESPN.com had a prompt on Twitter, and I'll see if I can find it just to get the exact wording. He said, give me your picks for your team's breakout player, a starter last year but a star this year, sleeper, not a starter last year but a key guy this year, deep sleeper, a guy no one's talking about who will have real value, and then the biggest impact freshman. And for me, I said the breakout player, a starter last year who's going to be a star this year. I mean, do I even need to say it? You know it. It's Bengali Kamara. A sleeper who was not a starter last year, but to be a key guy this year, I said Dayon Hayes. A deep sleeper, the guy who no one's talking about who will have real value, I think is Sibo Flemister. He's the guy I picked. The freshman I picked, Kenny Johnson. That's, as Noah Hiles from the Post-Gazette called it, that's the chalk pick, is to pick Kenny Johnson as the impact freshman. But I mean, you look at last year, Rodney Hammond in 8 games had 465 rushing yards. I think Sibo Flemister can play more than 8 games and end up with more than 465 rushing yards. I think he can make a significant impact. Hammond scored 5 rushing touchdowns. I think Sibo can at least get that, if not more. Daniel Carter will probably vulture a few touchdowns there as well as a short yardage back, even if I think his role might expand beyond that. But I think Sibo could potentially, get a decent chunk of carries and put up some pretty solid production. We're not really talking about him. We don't talk about Sibo very much. I've mentioned him off and on throughout the summer in the offseason, but I really think he's got a chance to be a contributor at running back for this offense. Previn says, based on the comments from Pat Narduzzi, is the passing game actually good? Is the secondary not very good? Or most likely, is it a little bit of both? And you're always going to have that sort of duality in training camp, right? That if Phil Dracovic, who pops up on the screen here, is just completing passes all over the place and Bub Means is making plays up and down the field, well, is that a good thing for the offense or a bad thing for the defense? You're more encouraged by the offense or more discouraged by the defense. And I think the coaches are constantly wrestling with that, trying to balance it. I think ideally they would have it split 50-50 down the middle, that they go into their scrimmage and guys make plays because they're making great plays, not because the other side of the ball is making mistakes. That, wow, that was a super athletic turnover, a great read on the ball, great read to jump the pass and get the interception. It wasn't a bad pass. It was just a great play by the defender. Or boy, that wide receiver just jumped, had great positioning and out jumped the corner and just made an unbelievable catch. That's what they would like to have, where yes, one side wins and the other side loses, but the loser didn't really necessarily play poorly. The winner just played that much better. That would be the ideal scenario. And there's probably some element of that. I mean, when we're hearing about Phil Dracovic and Bub Means and Conte Mumfield and these guys making big plays and deep passes, they're likely happening against the corners, right? Against Marquez Williams, MJ Devonshire, and AJ Woods, in addition to a few of the other guys who are sort of filling out the depth. I don't think any of us have any concerns about Marquez Williams, MJ Devonshire, or AJ Woods. I think we expect them to be good because they've been good in the past and they should be even better this year. So I think when we hear about Bub Means making plays, and the deep passing game connecting, particularly against the first team defense, as long as we're talking about the corners, I think that's encouraging for the offense rather than discouraging for the defense. Now, it's a little bit more concerning when you start talking about the safeties. As we've talked about a lot of times, inexperience back there, new players taking over, transition can be tough at those positions, those safety positions, because there's so much on the safeties. And as we often say, when the safeties make mistakes, it's tallied in terms of points, not yards. And that's dangerous and that's scary. And so if you're seeing plays being made against the safeties because the safeties are making mistakes, that's a problem. I think those guys are good enough athletes. Donovan McMillan, who's on the screen, is a good enough athlete. Javon McIntyre, PJ O'Brien, Steph Hall, these guys can play. But do they know the position? Have they mastered the responsibilities and the assignments? Probably not. Not 100%, not to the level that Eric Hallett and Brandon Hill did. They're going to have a ways to go, and they're going to enter the season with a ways to go, and it's probably going to take a few games for them to figure it out. You hope it only takes a few games for them to figure it out. You don't want this to stretch into midseason and beyond. But look, we've seen new starters go through a period of transition. My guy, Bengali Kamara, did not necessarily start off the season great last year. It took him a while to get going and really understand it. I think Eric Hallett took a little while to get going. I think Brandon Hill in his first game, remember the Florida State game, after the first game after Paris Ford left the team, Brandon Hill stepped into that boundary safety spot at Florida State. They had an off week after that disaster against Notre Dame, and Brandon Hill showed some signs of inexperience. And so you're probably going to have some of that. Now, flip side again. If the safeties are making mistakes, if they're blowing assignments or missing coverages or responsibilities or whatever it is, that's a bad thing. You need the safeties to be better. But I'll find the silver lining. You want your offense to be able to take advantage of those mistakes, right? You want Phil Dracovic and these receivers to be on the field. The ball is snapped and they see that a safety is misaligned or see that a safety is not playing his assignment and an opportunity has presented itself. You want to be able to capitalize. So even if they're getting these deep passes against the safeties because the safeties are making mistakes, I'm taking a little bit of encouragement from the fact that the offense is capitalizing on those situations. So, it's probably a little bit of both, but for now, it's training camp. It's the third week of camp. I think we can just look at the optimistic, encouraging sides and wait for the negatives to show themselves in the season. Ski77 says, Alliance 412 made a big deal about the creation of the Oakland Originals and the team-wide NIL deal in football. Is it really that big of a deal? Do any other schools have a team-wide NIL deal? Do you know of any recruits on the fence or committed elsewhere that are now leaning Pitt? And I'm going to add another question in here. Belzik927 says, is there any way to get a feel for how Alliance 412 NIL announcements stack up with what collectives are offering at some of our competitors? I'm excited about the announcements, but it seems the true evaluation is relative to the rest of college football. What percentile would we be in if such a thing could be measured in that way? Thanks. So two questions about the Alliance and obviously the announcement last week that Alliance 412 is doing a team-wide NIL deal with the entire scholarship roster. A 7-figure deal these kids are going to net, 5 figures annually out of this deal. A couple things. There are other team-wide NIL deals that we've seen from time. Well, here's what I should say before we even get into that. One of the biggest concerns about NIL, and one of the things that coaches have brought up a lot, and administrators, and a lot of people who've looked at it, is that there's not a lot of transparency. There's no, national database of what players are getting, of what schools are, what collectives are providing. None of this. You don't see it. You hear stories, and some things end up getting reported, but there's even cases where I think recruits or transfers are talking to schools and saying, well, I could get this from that school. I got offered this from that school. I heard this guy's getting that from that school or whatever. And the coaches have no way to really verify it or confirm it because there's no transparency. There's no real accountability. There's no real reporting. And I don't mean in a journalistic sense. I mean reporting in sort of a administrative sense. There's no real reporting of these deals and what's actually transpiring. And so it's all, I shouldn't say all. Some of it's speculation, some of it's conjecture, some of it's guessing, some of it's actual sourced reporting, some of it people are just coming outright and stating it. But you don't have a clear, concrete idea. So you kind of poke around, you look at this, you look at that. Yeah, there are other team-wide NIL deals that have been reported in the last 2 years. How do they compare to Pitt's? I don't know. Because again, the transparency is just not there, so you don't really know what's happening, and so it's tough to compare to other schools, I would say this. I think the operation that Alliance 412 has put together, culminating with this team-wide NIL deal, and that doesn't, when I say culminating, that doesn't necessarily mean this is the end stage, but leading up to building up to this over the last 2 years, including the Oakland Originals project, which we'll talk about in a second. I don't want to sit here and say it's unprecedented. I don't want to sit here and say nobody else in the country is doing this, but I will say I think this particular deal is as good as anyone else is doing. From everything I've seen, from everything I've heard, this is right there at the top. I don't want to say it's the best, but I think it's competitive with any other, similar deals that we've seen. There may be individual players getting more because of their stature, and who they are and where they are and all those things. But in terms of something that really elevates the program as a whole, I don't think there's a whole lot that competes with what Alliance 412 did here on the NIL front. And there aren't many who can look at it and say, well, we're doing this and it's better. As to the Oakland Originals program, and this is probably an important point that we should have talked about more, maybe independent of a mailbag, and we probably will. This got announced first. This got announced before the team-wide NIL deal, and the reception was lukewarm, to put it mildly, I think. People just weren't moved by whatever this is, a media production company or something like that. What you have to understand is how that Oakland Originals project fits in with everything else that Alliance 412 is doing. Ultimately, the goal is to generate revenue income for the players through NIL opportunities. The Oakland Originals project helps create that middle ground, helps create that avenue for generating the revenue for the student athletes, the NIL revenue. If you have lump sum of cash, let's put it that way. If you have lump sum of money and you have student athletes and you have to find a way to connect the two through the letter of the rule, the letter of the law and the rules that have been put down, Oakland Originals, I think, in my understanding of it, as an entity, helps facilitate making that happen. In addition to giving the student athletes an opportunity to create content that they want to create and ultimately help with brand building, which I go back and forth about that concept. But I think as it functions in the transactional nature of NIL and NIL revenue, Oakland Originals, I think, is vastly important to the entire operation. And I think that'll become more apparent over time. I think people who've been able to take a big picture view and have some perspective on it understand how important it is. I think the initial reaction was lukewarm because people didn't really understand how it functioned into the overall operation. But it's becoming pretty clear that that's going to be a key piece and maybe fill in a key piece that was missing from Alliance 412's goals and execution. So I think that's pretty important, and I think we answered most of the questions in there. And Ski 77 says, "Is it really that big of a deal?" Yeah, I think it's a huge deal. I think it's a really, really big deal. All right. All right. We'll take Cats 2007 says, "What's the buzz after the basketball trip? Anything outside of what's been talked about on the boards?" No, I think we've covered a lot on the message boards. I mean, just based on what we've observed, based on what we've been told from the basketball team's trip to Spain over the last 2 weeks. There were the 2 games. We got some stats from the 2 games. We were able to find video of the second game and watch that. I think the big takeaways were that the young guards look really good, particularly Carlton Carrington, who can be another ball handler and give this team 3 point guards ultimately to play with Carrington, Jalen Lowe, and Dior Johnson. I think that was a big takeaway. One big takeaway was that Blake Hinson just looks like he's ready to be Blake Hinson, and an even better version of Blake Hinson than he was a year ago. Another takeaway is that Zach Austin and Ishmael Leggett look like they're going to be able to help this team again. And one of my biggest takeaways is just that is something we've talked about all offseason, which is that this team is going to look very different than they looked last year. It's a very different kind of Pitt team but one I think can be really dangerous and really good, and pretty fun to watch. They haven't had players like, they didn't have a player like Zach Austin last year. I don't think they had a player like Ishmael Leggett last year, and they didn't have Carlton Carrington or Jalen Lowe last year. These guys like to get out and run. They're fast, explosive, speedy freshmen. Zach Austin's a plus athlete who can jump out of the gym. Ishmael Leggett's a good shooter and really knows how to score from his time at Rhode Island. And then of course Blake Hinson's Blake Hinson, and we only saw one out of the three triplets of the Diaz-Graham twins and Federico. We only saw one out of those three guys actually play on this trip. I think there's still a lot of reason to be excited about those guys. So, look, it's August basketball. It's 3 months from the start of the actual season. So a lot can and will change between now and then. A lot of it probably for the better. But as an early sneak peek at the team and an early primer view of where they're at right now, seems pretty encouraging. It really does. All right, last question I wanted to get to. This is a good one from Thunder Pit Road from last week. I have to choose one: Highway 61, Blonde on Blonde, or Blood on the Tracks. And look, this is like choosing, I only have two kids, but if I had three, I would name them Highway 61, Blonde on Blood, or Blonde on Blonde, and Blood on the Tracks. I mean, Highway 61 is just one banger after another. Blonde on Blonde has Visions of Johanna, which I think is the greatest song ever written. Not just the greatest Bob Dylan song ever written, but the greatest song ever written. And Blood on the Tracks, every time a song ends, you think, okay, that was the best song on this album. And then the next one starts, and you're like, oh, geez, no, that's the best song. And you get down to like Buckets of Rain, and it's still incredible. I guess I would have to pick Blood on the Tracks, but it would be very, very hard to give up Highway 61 and Blonde on Blonde, because we're an incredible set of albums there. I'm going to go listen to some Dylan. You should go listen to some Dylan too. It's Friday. You got your morning pit in. It's the end of the week. You had a good week, hopefully. Getting closer to the end of August, getting closer to the start of the school year and all those things, getting closer to the football season. Enjoy your Friday and go listen to some Bob Dylan. I think that's what we should all do. That'd be a good way to kick into the weekend. In the meantime, go to homefieldapparel.com, promo code LAIR23, LAIR23, LAIR23 to get 15% off your first order of the best Pitt gear you are going to find, and then make sure you park it on Panther-Lair.com, Panther-Lair.com for all of the Pitt coverage. We'll be at training camp this morning for day 4 in a row. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, we'll be down there to close out the week with more training camp coverage, practice reports, videos, interviews, highlights, all those kinds of things. So make sure you stay tuned at Panther-Lair.com and like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Thanks so much for tuning in today. It's been a lot of fun. Hope you've enjoyed it as well. I hope you have a great weekend, and we will be back with you on Monday for another Morning Pit right here, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.